I worked these fields before the war. I saw what the occupiers did to our prisoners, especially young women. They used fear and humiliation. We remember, stand for each other, and rebuild.
At the start of the war, Nazi policy in the East rested on racial political ideas. The Eastern Front was treated as a space of coercion and the dismantling of existing institutions. Staff decisions often narrowed the application of international norms in practice, creating a gap between legal formulas on paper and what happened on the ground. Soviet women entered the war both as Red Army personnel and as civilians. Signallers, medical staff, anti-aircraft crews, reconnaissance workers, and clerks quickly became part of daily operations. Mass mobilization meant hurried training and shortages. In the border districts, medics and communications posts were frequently placed near the most vulnerable sectors and fell into encirclements within the first weeks of fighting. The legal backdrop was defined by interwar agreements, but the Eastern theatre moved differently. Categories of prisoner of war status, document checks, and registration were often pushed down to local echelons where decisions were made quickly amid lack of manpower, transport, and communications. This affected women in uniform because their status within formal categories was interpreted unevenly by different units and at different times. The geography of events covered advancing and retreating fronts, transit rail hubs, major rivers, and temporary collection points. Where the front moved fast, administrations and rules changed rapidly. For civilians, this meant registration under occupation and assignment to labour. For service women, it meant a decision on recognition of status and a route for transfer. Already in 1941, typical patterns of detention emerged on roads, near crossings, and in recently contested areas. The organisation of the first screening determined conditions of the journey and the chance of medical help. By the end of the first year, the front lines had stabilised somewhat, but practices of treatment remained uneven. In the same area, from month to month, regime and discipline could differ depending on local garrisons and the situation. This set the main frame for the whole topic. Women faced not only the risks of combat and evacuation, but also the unpredictability of fast decisions made without a single standard. That inconsistency forms the background of the series and explains why the fates of prisoners diverge so widely, even under similar circumstances. The summer of 1941 rapidly expanded women's roles in the Red Army. Signallers, radio operators, nurses and doctors worked at forward aid posts in anti-aircraft units, reconnaissance, and staffs. Breakthroughs and encirclements in the first weeks tore communications, destroyed paperwork, and flipped authority in villages within a day. Small groups of women found themselves at crossings, road junctions, and field hospitals where status decisions were made quickly on the spot. Where organised registration existed, transfer followed. Where the procedure collapsed, arbitrariness appeared. Reactions of German units to women in uniform were uneven. In some sectors, guards conducted brief questioning and sent prisoners to transit points. In others, they denied combatant status, classing medics and signallers as partisan helpers or saboteurs. In combat zones, there were recorded summary executions, especially after attempts to flee or resist. Early in the campaign, there were also documented cases of sexual violence during sweeps and arrests. These incidents emerged in conditions of chaos and weak oversight, and were used to intimidate and enforce control. Formal bans and disciplinary measures that existed on paper did not provide real protection at the line of contact. Medical personnel were especially exposed. Aid stations were overrun and captured, with the wounded still on stretchers. Women medics often remained with patients and were taken in groups. What followed was a short interrogation, a sorting by work fitness, and dispatch to a transit camp or local holding pen. Civilians on newly occupied ground faced registration with occupation authorities, requisitions of food and lodging, and assignment to forced labour. In the early phase, there were wild episodes where ad hoc guard teams acted on their own, a pattern reflected in post-war testimony and commission reports. By the end of 1941, regional differences were visible. Some areas built more regular procedures of counting and transport, which raised survival chances even under harsh conditions. Others kept improvisation as the default because of supply failures and constant troop movements. For women, the decisive moment was often the first hours after capture. If recognition and registration occurred, a predictable, though severe route of transfer followed. If capture remained outside status, the risk of reprisals, including sexual violence, rose sharply. This fork between registration and out-of-status seizure became central for everything that came next: transport, camp regimes, labour assignments, and the rare episodes of organised resistance. The moment of capture shaped almost everything that followed. Units were breaking contact, villages were changing hands, papers were missing, and small groups were gathered up at roadblocks, crossings, and aid posts. The first screening usually happened near the point of seizure. Identity was taken from badges and surviving paperwork. Questions were short, and the decision to register or refuse recognition often came from a junior officer under pressure. Women in uniform entered this funnel with additional uncertainty because some field echelons treated them as auxiliaries outside the combatant category. Arrest sites had recurring patterns. After a firefight, the search parties worked hedgerows, barns, and streamlines. In retreats, they closed roads and swept columns of stragglers. In newly occupied villages, they took names on a square or by the church and moved detainees to a yard behind a school or a storehouse. Where command discipline held, women were counted, marked for transfer, and held with other prisoners. Where command was weak, the screening blended into intimidation and reprisals. There were recorded cases in which sexual violence was used during searches or while moving groups across short distances. Such incidents were most frequent in the first night after capture, when oversight was minimal and guards acted without clear supervision. Sorting followed quickly. Those judged fit for work were kept together. The sick and the wounded were separated, sometimes left at a local point with a promise of later pickup, sometimes pushed on despite obvious need. Medical orderlies who tried to remain with the injured drew attention, and risked being treated as partisans. Signallers and staff workers had similar problems because their skills were useful, yet their status was often disputed. Civilians caught in the same sweep faced a parallel process under occupation rules. Registration meant a paper slip and an assignment to labour or relocation. Lack of registration meant uncertain detention and greater dependence on the attitude of the nearest guard detachment. Conditions in the first 24 hours were rough. Food and water were irregular. Nights were spent in barns, sheds, or open fields without cover. Cold, rain, and exhaustion magnified every other risk. Punishments were immediate for attempts to speak to locals, to discard unit insignia, or to step out of a line. There were also rare moments of mitigation. A senior non-commissioned officer could insist on proper counting. A local interpreter could persuade guards to keep a small group together until transport arrived. These interventions did not erase the larger pattern, but they occasionally shifted an outcome from reprisal to transfer. The fork that defined later fate was simple and hard. If registration and listing occurred within a day, the route led toward a transit camp with predictable though severe routines. If recognition was refused, women remained in a grey zone of improvised holding where the risks of beatings, sexual violence, and summary execution were highest. By the end of 1941, this fork was visible across many districts. It explains why accounts from similar places on the same dates diverged so sharply. What changed the path was not a general rule, but the balance, in that first day, between control and improvisation at the lowest level of command. If a woman reached a point where prisoners were formally counted, the process shifted from seizure to intake. Registration meant a name or alias, unit if known, age, specialty, and health notes. In practice, records were fragmentary, and many entries were made from memory or by interpreters under pressure. Women in uniform were frequently categorized as auxiliaries rather than combatants, which affected everything that followed: housing block, labour assignment, and eligibility for male or medical attention. Sorting paired paperwork with a physical check. The aim was not care but throughput. Who could work, who would be held, who would be moved. Fit prisoners were marked for transport to transit camps or directly to labour detachments attached to farms, workshops, sawmills, or depots. The sick and wounded were divided again. Some left in local facilities with minimal attention, Others pushed onward in the same column. Medical orderlies who asked to stay with wounded comrades risked being flagged as uncooperative. Signallers and clerks were sometimes retained near staff billets because their skills were useful, though their status remained contested. Intake was also a point of exposure. There are recorded cases of sexual violence during line-up, body searches and night confinement in improvised sheds before transport. Such incidents were likelier where oversight was weak, where guards rotated frequently, or where intake points were set up in abandoned schools and barns without fixed routines. Elsewhere, the same stage could pass with roughness, but without assault if a senior non-commissioned officer enforced discipline, if women were processed in groups rather than singly, and if transport arrived quickly. Paper routes mattered. A stamped slip, even with errors, increased the chance of reaching a transit camp where routines, however harsh, existed. Without paperwork, a prisoner might be shunted between local holding pens, exposed to reprisals for any delay, and miss the window for group transport. Civilians swept up alongside soldiers faced parallel procedures under occupation rules: registration, assignment to labour, curfews, movement limits. For both groups, the first correct entry in a ledger could mean the difference between inclusion in a scheduled convoy and being left to the discretion of a small guard detachment. By late 1941 and early 1942, intake grew more systematic in some districts. Fixed days for convoys, named transit yards, predictable rail spurs. Elsewhere, chaos persisted, and the same village produced contradictory outcomes a week apart. The pattern is consistent across accounts. Where registration and sorting were performed under a stable routine, survival odds rose. Where they broke down, punishment, sexual violence, and disappearance were more common. Once a woman was counted and marked for movement, the struggle shifted to the road and the railhead. Columns formed at dawn, guarded by mixed details who were themselves exhausted. Marches were short in distance but long in hours, broken by halts in farmyards or on the edge of stations where trains were being assembled. Water was the first problem, bread the second. Where local command kept a roster and timed departures, the routine, though harsh, reduced chaos. Where it did not, prisoners waited in open fields, exposed to weather and to the moods of guards. Rail transport came in waves. Boxcars held mixed groups. Red Army personnel, civilians under occupation rules, sometimes children with mothers, separated only by corners of straw and a bucket. Doors were shut for long stretches. Air and light came through gaps in boards. At junctions, the train could stand for hours as priority loads passed. Fuel, ammunition, troops. In these pauses, discipline often frayed. There are documented cases of beatings during water distribution, theft of rations, and sexual assault during night halts. The risk rose when convoys were small, when cars were left on sidings without supervision, or when the escort rotated and no one felt responsible for order. Transit points were meant to impose some structure. Yards behind stations, fenced fields, or abandoned depots served as intake hubs with rough lists and chalk tallies on wagon doors. Here prisoners might receive a ladle of soup, a medical glance, and instructions for the next leg. The medical glance was rarely treatment. It was a note fit for work, unfit, wounded. Even this minimal sorting mattered. Being tagged fit usually sent women toward labour detachments attached to farms, sawmills, or factories. Being tagged unfit could mean a return to the same car with no plan, or a transfer to a shed with the promise of later pickup that did not come. Attempts to escape did occur, mostly during marches between rail and yard, or when doors were briefly unbarred. Punishments were immediate: beatings, deprivation of food, and in some places summary shooting in front of the line. Civilians who tried to pass for locals during station halts occasionally succeeded with the help of bystanders, but such help brought danger to those who offered it. More often the presence of interpreters or a firm non-commissioned officer decided whether the handover to the next escort happened cleanly or dissolved into intimidation. Paperwork, even flawed, was a survival tool. A stamped slip tied a name to a car and a destination, reducing the chance of being shunted endlessly between sidings. Without it, women could spend days in a loop of holds and returns that magnified every risk: cold, hunger, assault, and disease. By early 1942, some corridors developed predictable cadences, fixed collection days, known sidings, named transit camps. Elsewhere, the same geography remained volatile, and outcomes depended on who stood with the ledger at the ramp when the doors finally slid open. Behind the front, the holding system split into temporary pens, transit camps, and longer-term sites, dulags for intake, stalags and subcamps for labour, and, in some districts, women's sections or separate compounds. Layouts were improvised at first fenced fields, barns, schoolyards, then hardened into barracks with roll call squares, guard towers and sheds for tools and stores. Routine was the instrument of control: dawn counts, work details, evening counts, lights out. Any delay a sick prisoner at the gate, a missing head in a work gang stopped the line and drew punishment that fell on everyone in the block. Women's housing varied. In some places a few barracks inside a larger male camp formed a Frauenblock, guarded by the same unit and fed from the same kitchen. Elsewhere, a separate enclosure stood a few hundred metres away with its own gate and roll call square. Overcrowding was the rule. Triple-tier bunks held more bodies than the building could air. Windows were nailed or warped, stoves were few, and fuel was rationed by the armful. Ventilation and dampness shaped the winter. Frost inside, wet straw underfoot. A cough that spread in rows and lasted for weeks. Administration set the tone. A firm, non-commissioned officer could keep counts clean, stop random searches at night, and insist on group movements that limited exposure. A lax or violent guard cadre produced a different rhythm. Sudden inspections, forced standing in the yard, collective penalties for imagined slights, and a higher chance of assault in the shadows between barracks and latrines. Sexual violence occurred, most often where separation from male blocks was weak, where night patrols were thin, or where work detachments returned after dark through unlit corridors. Women learned to move in pairs, to time latrine visits, and to trade a place in line for a safer slot under a watchful cell leader. Work shaped the day and the diet. Kitchens and laundry promised a roof and a few degrees more warmth, but also proximity to guards and constant orders. Sawmills, fields, and brickworks cost flesh and fingers. Return to the gate meant inspection boots, hands, apron, then soup and bread if supplies arrived. The soup was thin and hot, the bread stiff and counted by weight. In many camps, women ate after men's details, when pots were already scraped and the queue long. Extra calories came from rare parcels, kitchen peelings, or a spoon traded for a stitch mended. Hunger made rules elastic, and punishment for theft from the kitchen was swift. Discipline lived in paperwork. A card noted infractions and rewards. A lighter task for a week, an indoor assignment, a letter aloud. More often it recorded lateness at roll call, talking in line, a missing tool, an argument with an escort. The card followed a woman from block to block and eased or hardened each next decision. Whether she was sent to the infirmary or told to stand outside, whether she joined a factory detail or was kept on heavy yard work. In some districts, chapels or Red Cross visits appeared late in the war and brought short windows of oversight. In others, there was nothing but the watch at the gate and the clock on the barrack wall. Across sites, the pattern repeats. Where separation and routine were enforced evenly, harassment was lower and survival higher, though still precarious. Where the system ran on improvisation and threat, the women's blocks became the most exposed place in the compound, with violence more likely to be used as a means of order. The difference often came down to the guard roster and the senior corporal at the roll call square small cogs that decided whether the day passed as a grind or broke into fear. Work was the spine of the system. Once intake was complete, most women were assigned to labour detachments attached to farms, factories, sawmills, brickworks, depots, road gangs or railway yards. Quotas came first. A number of rows hoed, logs stacked, baskets carried, bricks moulded, metres of track tamped. The day began in the dark with roll call and ended in the dark at the gate. A foreman's chalk marks on a board, often arbitrary, decided whether a block got soup on time or stood longer in the yard. Agricultural details looked survivable on paper and drained strength in practice. Fieldwork meant distance to the site, Wind, rain, and long hours bent over. Women carried sacks, pulled carts, and cleared stubble with dull tools. Industrial tasks carried different risks. Hands crushed at presses, splinters from fresh timber, caustic fumes in dye rooms, burns at kilns. Safety guards were missing or ignored, and the pace was set by fear of punishment rather than output science. Underfulfillment of the quota brought standard penalties: loss of rations, extra shifts, standing outside after lights out, confinement. Supervision varied with place and season. On small farms, a single guard and a civilian overseer could enforce order through proximity. In large yards, the line dissolved at the far end, and discipline relied on surprise checks, informers, and the threat of collective punishment. Sexual harassment and assault occurred most often at the margins of the shift on the way to the site, in storage sheds, or when a woman was sent to fetch something out of sight lines. Women responded with quiet tactics, moving in pairs, trading spots to stay near a known escort, volunteering for tasks that kept them within view, or choosing heavier work to avoid isolation. Food was tied to work. A good day brought a thin soup at noon and a measure of bread on return. A bad day meant cold soup, a smaller piece, or a skipped distribution under pretext of lateness or insolence. Some details could glean peelings from kitchens or barter scraps for mending. Others had nothing to trade. Parcels, when they came, were shared and immediately noted by guards. Hunger created a grey economy of favours, messages carried, a tool hidden and produced at inspection, a stitch done for a kitchen worker. Each favour carried risk if discovered. Injuries rarely led to real treatment. The infirmary, where it existed, issued a day off or a bandage and sent women back to the line. Work fit was the default mark, and foremen resisted losing hands even briefly. Wounded or sick prisoners fell behind on quotas, lost rations, and slipped into a cycle of weakness that was hard to reverse. A few assignments acted as lifelines: laundry, kitchen, sorting rooms, textile repairs. They offered shelter and minutes indoors at the cost of proximity to guards and the constant risk of accusation for theft. The line between discipline and punishment was thin. A missing tool, a broken handle, or a wrong word could trigger a search, a public rebuke, or a blow. Collective penalties, an entire gang kept standing while a single person was questioned, were common. Yet within the same district, another detachment might run by a rule of steady pace and fixed breaks, with fewer assaults and more predictable rations. Survival depended on landing in the latter and staying there. Where routine replaced whim, women lasted. Where whim ruled, the day's labour did not just take strength. It took position, safety, and the small margins that made the next morning possible. Health set the horizon for everything else. Intake checks were cursory temperature by touch, a glance at wounds, a note in pencil, and were aimed at throughput, not treatment. In many places there was no true infirmary, only a room with cots or a corner screened off in a barrack. The default mark was work fit. Anything short of a fever or a visible fracture sent a woman back to roll call. This created a steady slide: minor infection to weakness, weakness to missed quota to ration cuts, and from there to a cycle that was difficult to break. Winter and damp were constant multipliers. Barracks leaked, stoves were rationed, and straw stayed wet underfoot. Coughs became lines of coughs, colds turned into bronchitis. Frostbite started as numbness on marches and ended as cracked skin that never warmed through at night. In summer, the problems shifted: heat, dehydration at outdoor sites, and intestinal illness from poor water. Lice and scabies moved through blocks despite inspections. Delousing days existed, but the effect faded within a week when bedding and clothes returned to the same crowded space. Medical staff inside camps were few. A prisoner nurse could clean a wound and change a bandage, but supplies were thin and tools improvised. Guards and civilian foremen resisted removing workers from shifts. Fit for light duty was accepted only when a supervisor needed someone indoors anyway. Women learned small tactics for survival: a shared scarf across the chest on marches, a switch from field detail to laundry to stay near hot water, a timed visit to the infirmary when a sympathetic orderly was on duty. These were not cures, they were margins that kept a person above the point where work and cold finished the job. Sexual assault added a medical dimension that the system did not acknowledge. There were recorded cases where women sought help after night incidents and received neither examination nor rest, only a return to duty. Others hid injuries to avoid questions and reprisals. Informal care networks formed around trusted medics and older prisoners who knew which symptoms could be managed with rest, hot liquid, or a clean rag, and which required a gamble asking for the infirmary and hoping the request did not bring punishment. Psychological strain ran alongside physical illness. Sudden loss of family, uncertainty about unit mates, and the daily compression of roll calls and orders produced insomnia, panic spells, and flat exhaustion. There was no language for this in ledgers. The signs appeared as lateness, silence, or a missed step at the gate, and brought disciplinary notes instead of help. Rarely, external visits, Red Cross teams late in the war, a chaplain in some districts brought a day of order and cleaner halls. More often, health outcomes reflected the same split visible everywhere else. Where routine and minimal care were enforced evenly, women lasted longer. Where improvisation and threat were the only rules, illness moved faster than any remedy the prisoners could invent. Violations were not just rumoured, they were recorded in multiple kinds of documents. As front lines shifted, commissions gathered testimony in liberated towns, catalogued injuries, and listed names, places and dates. Camp records, when preserved, showed punishments entered as dry ledger lines. Standing outside for hours, loss of rations, confinement. Post-war interrogations of guards and civilian overseers added another layer, describing how orders were interpreted on the ground. None of these sources is complete, but together they outline recurring practices that affected women directly. Beatings and forced standing were the most common punishments, used for lateness at roll call, missed quotas, or speaking in line. Sexual violence appears in filings as assault or abuse, often tied to night searches, latrine corridors, or returns from work details after dark. The pattern is consistent with what women describe in testimony. Risk peaked at the margins of routine, where oversight was weakest and movement was least controlled. In some places, senior non-commissioned officers kept the gate area lit and insisted on group movement to and from the latrines. In others, the same spaces became zones of threat. The difference shows up clearly in the rate of reported incidents across similar camps. Executions were recorded with sparse words: shot during escape, shot for insubordination, shot at the fence. For women, the trigger was often tied to the same fork seen earlier: registered prisoner versus out-of-status detainee. Where registration and paperwork existed, a woman might be punished inside the system. Where they did not, reprisal was more likely to be immediate and final. Civilian women under occupation faced parallel risks. During sweeps after partisan actions, lists were made quickly, and women suspected of carrying messages or sheltering fighters were exposed to both physical punishment and assault during house searches and roadblock inspections. Forced labour violations followed the same logic. Quotas were raised without notice. Food was withheld as a block penalty when one person fell short. Injuries at mills or brickworks were counted as own fault and used to justify ration cuts. In a few districts, women found buffers: a factory manager who wanted steady output and kept guards out of the floor space, a local nurse who argued for infirmary rest after accidents. These cases do not cancel the pattern. They show how much outcomes depended on individuals with small amounts of authority. Documentation also records moments of resistance, refusals to work on uniform production, slowdowns in laundry and kitchen blocks, and coordinated complaints during inspection rounds appear in reports. The immediate response was punishment, but sometimes the administration reassigned tasks rather than escalate, especially late in the war when labour was scarce and disruptions spread quickly if handled brutally. These outcomes are visible not as victories but as changes in routine. A block moved from night shifts to day shifts. A gate opened earlier to shorten the return in darkness, A guard rotated off a corridor known for assaults. The record is uneven, and silence in a ledger does not mean safety. Yet across liberated districts and surviving files the outline holds. Violence, including sexual violence, clustered where routine and oversight broke down. Paperwork and predictable movement damped the risk without removing it. For women, the difference between those two environments was often the difference between a day that ended at the barrack door and a day that did not. Ravensbrück was the central reference point for women's imprisonment in the Reich. It began as a women's camp and grew into a complex with satellite sites and factory links. Prisoners arrived from many countries. Soviet women appeared in waves tied to front changes and labour needs. The layout followed the standard pattern barracks in ranks, a roll call square, workshops, perimeter towers, yet the internal economy was distinct. Textile and mending rooms, laundry, kitchens and sorting sheds sat beside harsher details in adjacent industry. The camp's logic was to extract labour while keeping routine tight enough to prevent breakdown. For Soviet prisoners the starting position was lower. Language, perceived status, and the wartime category of East shaped assignment and punishment. Women were routed to heavy outdoor details or into sewing and repair rooms that fed uniform production. Refusals and slowdowns brought the same penalties seen elsewhere: standing outside after dark, ration cuts, and confinement. Testimony from different national groups converges on one point. Outcomes depended heavily on the block staff, the guard roster on a given week, and whether movement was in groups or by isolated errands. Health conditions tracked the broader system. Overcrowding, lice, and chronic underfeeding set the baseline. Infirmary meant a bed if one was free and a day or two under a blanket. Supplies were limited and return to the line was the rule. Winter compounded every deficit. Cracked skin, coughs that lingered, and lost weight that did not return. Summer brought dehydration and stomach illness in outdoor details. Sexual violence appears in accounts as a persistent risk, especially on the edges of routine night corridors, latrines, work returns after dusk, searches. Where patrols were thin or separation between areas broke down, incidents rose. Where a senior non-commissioned officer enforced lighting and group movement, the rate fell. Ravensbrück also preserved cases of organised refusal. One strand concerned production for the German forces. Small groups of nurses and orderlies cited rules of treatment for prisoners and resisted sewing assignments. Administration responses varied. Immediate punishments were common, yet reassignment sometimes followed when disruption threatened factory quotas. These shifts show the camp's dual logic late in the war: labour first, punishment calibrated to preserve output. The same logic produced occasional concessions that mattered on the margins: earlier return gates in winter, a change from night to day shifts, or the removal of a guard known for assaults. Transfers to and from Ravensbrück marked the later phases. As fronts moved, women were rerouted to satellite sites, to external factories, or back through the camp for redistribution. Paper trails were partial, cards lost, names misspelled, numbers written over. The result is that two women with similar routes might leave very different footprints in records. What the surviving fragments agree on is the pattern of control. Routine roll calls at set times, group movement, fixed work details, lowered the chance of arbitrary violence without eliminating it. Breaks in routine late returns, ad hoc searches, night movements raised the risk. By early 1945, evacuation orders and overcrowding strained the system. Guards rotated, counts grew erratic, and the camp's ability to impose its usual cadence weakened. Even then the same split held. Where a corridor remained lit and supervised, women passed to the barrack door. Where supervision thinned, the most vulnerable crossings between latrine and block, workshop and gate, became the places where a day could turn. Ravensbrück's record is stark, not because it was unique, but because it concentrated the women's camp experience into one site whose routines and their failures can be traced with unusual clarity. Stutthof near Danzig began as a civilian internment site and expanded into a concentration camp complex with dozens of subcamps tied to farms, workshops, and industry. Women appeared in larger numbers from 1944 as fronts moved and labour demand rose. The layout was stricter than in many transit sites: fenced sectors, barracks in rows, internal roads, and a gate regime that fixed movement by bell and whistle. Roll calls were long and frequent. Any discrepancy, an absent number, a late work gang, froze the compound until it was resolved. Assignments followed the same calculus seen elsewhere: extract labour, reserve the minimum of order. Women worked in brickwork, sawmills, peat cutting, field details, and in sorting rooms that handled clothing from arrivals and transfers. The pace was set by quotas and by the threat of collective penalties. A broken tool or a missed tally could hold a whole block at attention after dark. Food tied directly to output. Shortages were common, and distribution slid as the population swelled. The infirmary offered cots when available and basic dressings, but return to duty was the rule. Injuries at kilns, in timber yards, and on peat fields were frequent and rarely excused. Discipline rested on proximity and the guard roster. Some sections enforced separation between men's and women's quarters and kept corridors lit at night. Others did not. Sexual violence appears in testimony as a risk concentrated at the edges of routine during evening returns, in storage sheds, and on the path between latrines and barracks. Where a senior non-commissioned officer kept escorts tight and movement in groups, incidents fell. Where supervision thinned, intimidation and assault rose. Women adapted with quiet tactics, pairing up for errands, delaying latrine visits until a known patrol passed, trading work spots to stay within sight of a trusted overseer. Late 1944 brought harsher measures. Transports arrived faster than the camp could absorb them. Subcamps multiplied. Evacuations from the east added exhausted groups to an already strained system. Punishments grew blunter. Prolonged standing, confinement, bread cuts for whole blocks. Executions were recorded in ledger language: shot during escape, shot for insubordination without detail. For women denied clear POW status, the risk of reprisal outside formal procedures stayed high, especially in temporary pens set up before redistribution. Paper trails from Stutthof are fragmentary but consistent in pattern. Cards note infractions and movements. Lists tie names to work sites and back again. Post-war statements describe how orders were interpreted shift by shift. The through line is the camp's dependence on routine to keep violence useful to production. When routine held counts on time, escorts present, paths lit, arbitrary harm fell even as hardship remained. When routine frayed overcrowding, night movements, guard rotation, the most vulnerable crossings became the points where a day could break. Evacuation orders in early 1945 pushed Stutthof past its limits. Columns formed for marches toward the interior. Subcamps emptied and refilled. Records fell behind events. The same fork seen throughout the system returned in compressed form. Women who moved under organised escort had a chance to reach the next site alive. Those left in improvised holds or pushed onto the road without cover faced exposure, hunger, assault, and shooting at the slightest pretext. Stutthof's history reads not as a departure from the broader pattern, but as its late-war amplification: more bodies, less control, and a sharper divide between stretches of regimented misery and bursts of unrestrained force. Away from the best-known sites, a web of stalags and work detachments handled women under mixed rules. Stalag 337 and 346 appear in post-war files and survivor accounts as places where intake, labour and punishment ran on tight timetables but thin oversight. These were not purpose-built women's camps. Women were held in small compounds or blocks inside larger facilities, or parked in temporary pens before redistribution to farms, sawmills, road gangs and railway yards. Paperwork existed: cards, tallies, transfer slips, but names were misspelled, ages guessed, units unknown. A stamped line could carry a woman forward, a lost slip could strand her between gates for days. Regime depended on command style. In some weeks a senior NCO enforced separation from men's sectors, lit corridors, and group movement at dusk. In others guards rotated and routine collapsed into searches, sudden roll calls and yard penalties. Sexual violence shows in testimony as a recurring risk at the margins night corridors, latrines, storage sheds, returns from outside details, especially when escorts were thin, or movements ran after dark. Women developed protective habits already seen elsewhere, moving in pairs, timing errands, trading places in line to remain inside sight lines, volunteering for heavier but safer tasks close to a supervisor who kept order. Labour mirrored local economy. Around 337 and 346, details cut timber, loaded peat, moulded bricks, cleared snow from sidings, weeded fields, and stitched in repair rooms that processed clothing flows from other camps. Quotas and underfulfillment rules set the pace. A missed tally led to ration cuts, standing in the yard, confinement, or transfer to a harsher block. Injuries seldom excused absence. Work fit was the default mark, and infirmary cots were rationed by space rather than need. Parcels, when they appeared, were rare and closely watched. Kitchen scraps formed the grey economy of survival, traded for mending or for a safer place in a work gang. Transport through these stalags was constant. Trains arrived in bursts, columns formed at dawn, and lists lagged reality. Women might pass through in days or linger for weeks waiting for rail space, each delay multiplying exposure to cold, hunger, and intimidation. The same woman could appear in 3 ledgers with 3 spellings. Another might vanish from paper entirely after a night move to a subcamp. When escorts kept schedules, roll call, march, gate, return, the day ground forward. When schedules slipped, reprisals rose. Beatings during water distribution, yard penalties for a missing number, threats used to force speed at the gate. Executions and shootings were logged in ledger shorthand during escape, at the fence, for insubordination without explanation. For women denied clear POW recognition, the chance of reprisal outside formal punishment stayed highest in temporary pens and transfer yards. Yet even here, individual actors could bend outcomes. A depot foreman might insist on fixed breaks to keep output steady. A local nurse could argue a day's rest and get it. A corporal could refuse to send women alone across an unlit strip after dark. These interventions did not change the system. They changed a day. By late 1944, the flow thickened. Evacuations from the east poured through 337, 346, and similar nodes. Overcrowding strained separation, lighting, and escorts. Violations clustered where those thin controls failed. Early 1945 compressed all patterns. Hurried counts, night departures, lost lists, improvised holds. Women who moved under a maintained routine, escorts present, paths lit, group movement, had better odds of reaching the next site alive. Those pushed through gaps in the system met the same risks seen across the network, concentrated into shorter, harsher intervals that could decide everything between dawn and the gate. Aid posts and signal huts sat close to the line, so breakthroughs often swept them up with the wounded still on stretchers and radios still warm. Groups of nurses, orderlies, and signallers were captured together, usually without papers and with little time to prepare. Their skills made them visible and immediately useful. Guards and local administrators pulled women to clean wounds, boil instruments, carry litters, keep lists, or handle basic clerical tasks. At the same time, their military status was frequently disputed. Field echelons that refused to treat them as combatants denied standard POW registration and pushed decisions down to the nearest non-commissioned officer. That combination utility, without recognised status, shaped what came next. Initial screening was brief. A junior officer decided whether to register the group and move it toward a transit point or to hold it as irregulars. Medics who asked to stay with the worst cases drew attention and risked charges of disobedience. Signallers were often routed into clerical corners, sorting rooms, or external details where a civilian foreman wanted legible lists in steady hands. None of this guaranteed safety. Where routine held group movement, lit corridors, fixed escort days passed as grind. Where routine broke night returns, thin patrols, improvised holds, intimidation rose, and with it the risk of assault, including sexual assault at the edges of movement, latrine paths, storage sheds, unlit strips between gate and barrack. Work assignments reflected immediate need rather than policy. Infirmary rooms, when they existed, meant cots if one was free and a bucket line for water. Supplies were thin and fit for work remained the default mark. Clerical details promised a roof and minutes indoors but came with constant orders and proximity to guards. Quotas and under-fulfillment rules applied even here. Missed tallies brought ration cuts, prolonged standing or confinement. Women adapted with quiet tactics, pairing up for errands, trading positions to stay within sight of a stricter escort, volunteering for heavier but safer tasks close to a supervisor who enforced order. Transport added a second exposure. Medics were sometimes made to tend sick prisoners in boxcars or sidings, keeping a bucket chain moving and wiping faces with scarce water. That kept convoys alive enough to reach the next yard but cost the caregivers their own rations and rest. Signallers counted heads at doors, chalked numbers on wagon planks, and carried lists between a hut and the train. A single error could trigger collective penalties on a whole car. Accuracy did not guarantee protection if escorts rotated mid-route. There were rare buffers. A senior nurse among prisoners could organise a rota, swap a feverish woman into laundry for a day, or hide someone near a stove for an hour. A former dispatcher might keep a duplicate list to prevent lost names during transfer. A civilian foreman who cared about output could keep guards off a factory floor and insist on fixed breaks. These interventions did not change the system, but they shifted outcomes at the margin. A night that might have broken someone became a night that merely exhausted her. Across districts the pattern held. Usefulness brought visibility and proximity to authority. Only steady routine reduced arbitrary harm, and when routine failed, utility offered no shield. For millions of Soviet civilians, the first encounter with the occupier was not a camp gate, but a village square or a town office. Registration set the tone. Names taken by local administrators or police auxiliaries, temporary passes issued, curfews posted. Women were assigned to forced labour close to home cleaning roads, loading stores, harvesting for requisition, or dispatched to farms and workshops under guard. Papers governed movement between hamlet and field. A missing slip could mean a day in a holding shed, a beating at a checkpoint, or transfer to a transit pen for redistribution. The rules were simple in writing and elastic in use, depending on who held the ledger and the rifle that week. House searches, roadblocks, and workplace inspections framed daily risk. Food and clothing were requisitioned with receipts of little value. Any rumour of partisans brought sweeps, lists made in haste, men and women questioned in barns or schools, a few taken away to intimidate the rest. Sexual violence appeared in these margins during night visits by small patrols, along unlit paths to wells, or in storage rooms at work sites. Formal prohibitions and discipline on paper did not ensure protection in practice, especially in scattered rural areas where oversight was thin. Women adapted by travelling in pairs, timing water runs to patrol schedules, or seeking assignments that kept them within sight of others, even when the work was heavier. Labour itself was a survival equation. Fieldwork promised proximity to home but brought exposure to weather and guards. Workshops offered a roof and predictable hours, but placed women within the orbit of overseers who could withhold rations or levy collective penalties for imagined slights. Quotas, late returns and shortages created a grey economy. Peelings traded for mending, a safer place in a team exchanged for a favour, a few minutes near a stove earned by posting notices. None of this eliminated danger. It shifted the odds slightly in a world where small margins mattered. Accusations of collaboration and defiance cut both ways. A woman who accepted a kitchen job to feed children could later be marked as a helper. Another who refused a task might be beaten, jailed overnight, or sent to a labour column leaving at dawn. Local clergy, teachers and midwives sometimes acted as buffers writing notes, vouching for a widow, arranging a day's rest after illness, only to face punishment themselves if a sweep followed. The line between village and camp was thin. Miss a roll call, lose papers at a roadblock, anger the wrong guard, and the next stop was a fenced field beside a station, a number on a plank, and a journey east or west with no certain return. By late 1943 and 1944 the cycle accelerated. Retreats brought hurried evacuations, scorched earth seizures of stores, and harsher reprisals for any contact with partisans. Some districts saw brief improvements when new administrators imposed schedules and kept patrols out of homes at night. Others swung toward improvisation and threat as order collapsed. In all cases, the same fought governed outcomes. Where routine and visibility held, papers checked in daylight, work in groups, paths watched. Arbitrary harm fell without disappearing. Where those thin controls failed, the open village became a map of vulnerabilities, and the distance between a doorstep and a shed door could decide a life. Resistance in captivity rarely looked like banners or barricades. It was timing, silence, and small refusals that slowed a machine built on routine. Women learned to act within the schedule. Stretch roll call by asking for a recount. Misplace a tool that halted a line long enough for a sick worker to sit. Trade work spots so a vulnerable prisoner stayed near a stricter escort. Laundry and kitchen blocks could stage clean slowdowns by relabeling baskets or returning ladles late. Textile rooms misthreaded bobbins or produced seams that required rework. Each act carried risk. Punishments followed. Standing outside after dark, bread cuts, confinement. But in some shops, managers preferred output over spectacle and quietly reassigned whole teams rather than escalate. Mutual aid ran on trust and lists. A senior prisoner kept a shadow ledger to catch names that disappeared during transfers. A nurse circulated a rota so the weakest had an hour near the stove after return from a field detail. In winter, women pulled scraps of cloth into makeshift foot wraps and rotated them along bunks. Messages moved under lids and in cuff hems, a warning that a patrol was on a certain corridor, a note that the latrine path would be watched at dusk. These signals did not end danger. They shifted its timing and place, which was often the difference between a beating and a bruise, between a night exposed and a night inside. Open refusals happened, but rarely alone. In sewing rooms, some groups cited prisoner protections to avoid uniform production. In response, the administration imposed yard penalties, and then, facing lost quotas, moved the teams to cleaning or sorting. In medical corners, orderlies insisted on boiling instruments or changing dressings before roll call. A guard might bark, then allow 10 minutes simply because the room ran better afterward. The logic of resistance matched the logic of labour. Make disorder costlier than concession. Where this calculation succeeded, small rules changed. Earlier gates in winter, group movements to latrines, escorts added on dark paths. Help from outside was precarious. A factory foreman might keep guards off the floor to protect throughput. A local nurse at a siding argued a day's rest and won it. A clerk stamped a transfer slip that tied a name to a wagon and prevented a disappearance. Each act left a trace and exposed the helper to punishment if discovered. Inside, solidarity had its own limits. Hunger narrowed generosity. Fear thinned the ranks, and informers existed. Yet across camps and districts the same pattern held. Where prisoners organised time and watched each other's routes door to path, path to gate, gate to barrack, violence dropped without vanishing. Resistance did not overturn the system. It bent hours and corridors just enough that more women reached morning roll call still standing. By mid-1944, paper rules thickened as Germany tried to stabilise a deteriorating system. Circulars and field orders instructed camps and holding pens to standardise counts, separate quarters, register women consistently, and align rations and medical checks with general provisions. Some notices addressed women in uniform explicitly, calling for handling through fixed channels rather than ad hoc reprisals. On the ground, enforcement split along familiar lines. Where command cadres were stable and transport predictable, routines tightened. Where fronts moved and guards rotated, paper settled like dust and nothing changed. For prisoners, the difference showed up in hours and paths. In districts that took the directives seriously, evening returns were pulled forward to daylight, corridors were kept lit, and latrine trips moved in small groups with escorts. These small changes mattered because the edges of routine night crossings, unlit strips, isolated errands, were where intimidation and sexual assault most often occurred. In places that ignored the orders, the same edges remained exposed. Women still queued in darkness at gate checks, still crossed yards without escorts after late shifts, still waited on sidings for trains that never came, while guards changed and responsibility evaporated. Registration improved in pockets. New ledgers appeared, names were re-entered from memory, and transfer slips were stamped more regularly. A stamped slip did not bring safety, but it tied a person to a convoy and lowered the chance of being lost between pens. It also narrowed space for arbitrary punishment. With a name and a work detail on paper, guards were likelier to use ration cuts, yard penalties, or confinement than immediate reprisal. Where ledgers lagged or vanished, the old grey zone persisted. Improvised holds, searches at night, and punishments handed out in the yard with no record. Labour assignments shifted under the same pressure. Factory managers and farm overseers argued for steady crews and pressed camps to keep escorts on paths and to provide fixed breaks. The argument was not compassion, but throughput machines ran better when fear did not scatter the line. In a few places this yielded tangible concessions: day shifts replacing night shifts in winter, a warm room for 10 minutes before roll call, or the removal of a guard whose corridor produced repeated incidents. Elsewhere, shortages erased any gains. Overcrowding forced mixed routes through men's sectors, escorts thinned, and the very attempts to standardize became pretexts for more searches and more delays at the gate. Medical corners saw the same split. Directives called for quarantine space and minimal treatment for fever and injuries. Where a doctor and a steady orderly existed, women got a day in a cot and returned with bandages that actually held. Where not, fit for work remained the default, and a fever meant standing outside until the count closed. Sexual violence remained a medical reality the rules did not name. Even in better-run sections, after-dark movement and thin patrols left gaps that paperwork could not close. By late 1944, enforcement mapped the system's limits. Routine could be tightened, and for some women that meant fewer arbitrary shocks and safer corridors. But routine could not outrun retreat, shortages, and rotation. The directives drew a line on paper. Whether that line existed in a yard at dusk depended on the roster, the rail schedule, and the corporal with the lantern at the corner where most days turned. Evacuation orders in early 1945 pressed the system past its limits. Camps and stalags received instructions to clear blocks, destroy files, and move prisoners toward the interior ahead of the front. For women, this meant sudden roll calls before dawn, bundles tied with string, and formation into columns guarded by mixed details. Camp guards, police auxiliaries, soldiers on leave. The first kilometres set the pattern. Pace too fast for the weak, halts too short for water, beatings for stragglers. Those unable to keep up were pulled to the roadside. Some were left in barns or schoolhouses under a token guard. Others were shot and logged later as during escape. Routes shifted with bridges, snow and rumours. Columns looped around rail nodes and river crossings, waited hours on frozen verges while carts and detachments passed, then moved again as daylight failed. Nights brought the worst risks. Billets in sheds without doors, crowded church porches, open fields if no village would accept them. Sexual violence clustered at these margins when escorts rotated, when small patrols peeled women off to check papers, when groups were broken into tens for lodging. In better organised movements, senior non-commissioned officers kept women together under a named escort and insisted on group sleeping spaces. Where command thinned, isolation and intimidation rose. Food and water were improvised. A ladle of soup appeared at a roadside kitchen one day and nothing the next. Villagers along the route tried to pass bread or hot liquid. Sometimes guards allowed it. Sometimes they drove donors back with rifle butts. Disease moved through the columns, dysentery from bad water, frostbite from hours without shelter, fevers that emptied strength in a day. A few prisoners learned to read the map by habit, skirt the icy ditch, stay on the lee side in wind, trade a place near the front of the file for the chance to reach billets before doors were barred. Rail segments did not mean relief. Boxcars were loaded beyond count, doors shut, and cars shunted from siding to siding as military trains took priority. Air raids forced evacuations from trains into ditches, then back aboard in confusion. Transfers between lines created gaps where names were lost and groups split. Women who carried stamped slips tied to a convoy had better odds of remaining within a single chain of custody. Without paper, a prisoner could vanish into the shuffle of cars and columns. Liberation often arrived as a change of noise, artillery nearer, orders shouted in a new language, guards slipping away at dawn. In some places local officials took charge, posted notices and called doctors. In others the columns simply dissolved on a road while those still standing walked toward the nearest town. The pattern that governed the entire system held to the end. Where routine and supervision survived even in fragments group movement, a kept list, a named escort arbitrary harm fell without disappearing. Where routine failed, evacuation became a moving yard of exposure, and the distance between a gate and the next village could decide who saw the spring. Liberation did not end control. It changed its form. Women who survived camps, marches and occupied territories passed into assembly points run by Allied or Soviet authorities. There they faced new queues, new questions and new files, names, birthplaces, units, dates of capture, routes through camps. Everything was asked again, often in rooms where exhaustion blurred memory. Medical checks looked for fever, lice, injuries, and infectious disease. Treatment was basic, but, for the first time in years, aimed at preservation rather than throughput. For many, this was the first clean bandage, the first careful examination, the first uninterrupted sleep indoors. Soviet repatriation camps added another layer. Returning women filled forms and sat through interviews intended to separate collaborators from those who had endured captivity. Nurses, signallers, and partisans had to recount where they had served and how they had been taken. Civilian women from occupied areas explained forced labour on farms and in workshops. The tone of these checks varied with officers and regions. Some saw only people who had survived enemy control, others treated captivity itself as a mark that required suspicion. The result was uneven. One woman received documents and travel orders within days, another spent weeks under observation before being cleared. Physical consequences followed them home: malnutrition, chronic infections, damaged joints, lung disease from years of damp and smoke, and untreated injuries shaped work and family life long after. Some could not return to previous trades, others faced a shortened span of strength and constant fatigue. Psychological strains surfaced in nightmares, startle reflexes, mistrust of uniforms and locked doors. There was little language for this. Most learned to keep it quiet. A number avoided discussing captivity at all, fearing misunderstanding or stigma. Social reception was mixed. Families who had waited simply took women back, patching life around gaps. Neighbours asked quiet questions or none. In some places whispers followed those who had worked under occupation, or in enemy factories, regardless of coercion. Official recognition focused on decorated frontline service. The experience of women who survived as prisoners or forced labourers remained on the margins. A few gave testimony to commissions or wrote accounts that would be published later. Many did not. Paper trails from repatriation show both care and blind spots. They list vaccinations, rations, travel routes, and assignments to new units or civilian posts. They rarely record sexual violence or the full weight of camp years, yet those gaps do not erase the pattern. For Soviet women, the end of captivity meant a passage through new institutions, new judgments, and a long effort to rebuild bodies and routines while carrying experiences that were seldom named. The war's formal conclusion did not simplify their stories. It sealed them into files and memories that would take decades to surface. After the war, the record of what women endured moved into courtrooms and interrogation rooms. Allied and Soviet investigators collected testimonies from former prisoners, local residents, guards, and camp staff. Major trials focused on command responsibility at well-known sites and on mobile units. Smaller proceedings, often less documented, dealt with individual overseers, medics, and block leaders accused of brutality, shootings, and abuse of prisoners, including women. Women's accounts entered these cases in fragments. They described beatings, forced labour beyond strength, deliberate starvation, and sexual violence used to intimidate or punish. Much of this appeared in cautious language. Abuse, indecent acts, misconduct, mistreatment during searches. Courts were more likely to press charges for killings, selections, and mass reprisals, where documents and multiple witnesses aligned. Violence that took place at night, in corridors, fields, or sheds, with few observers and no written order, was harder to prove. The burden often fell on survivors, whose memories were questioned against defendants who claimed to have followed regulations. Nevertheless, patterns were recognised. At Ravensbrück, Stutthof, and several stalags, evidence established systematic cruelty, lethal work quotas, and the use of terror to enforce discipline. Some commanders, doctors, and guards were sentenced to death or long prison terms. Others received lighter penalties or were released after short confinement. Jurisdictional limits, early Cold War politics, and the sheer scale of crimes meant many perpetrators were never tried at all. The contrast between what survivors described and what files recorded left visible gaps. Soviet tribunals added their own layer. They prosecuted crimes on occupied territory and in camps holding Soviet citizens. Verdicts cited executions, torture, outrages against women, and the organised exploitation of prisoners. Here too, documentation was uneven. Some cases were built solidly on converging statements. Others folded broad accusations into single charges. For women who testified, the process could bring a form of acknowledgement, but it rarely addressed everything they had lived through. Post-war justice drew a line, but not a complete one. It established that the treatment of prisoners and civilians' forced labour, starvation policies, selected killings was criminal. It recorded that women were targeted as prisoners, workers, and bodies under control. Yet the legal record captured only part of the experience. Many acts, especially sexual violence and day-to-day coercion, remained underreported or legally unnamed. The result is a map with clear-marked crimes and wide blank spaces, in which the lives of countless women who passed through camps and occupied towns are present only as numbers, initials, or a single line in a transcript. In the first post-war decades, what Soviet women had lived through in camps and under occupation surfaced only partially. Official narratives emphasized heroism at the front, partisan struggle and industrial endurance. Women fit this frame best as snipers, pilots, radio operators at headquarters, nurses who carried men from the battlefield. Their stories of captivity, forced labour, or abuse were rarely invited into public space. Many kept silent by habit, by shame that was not theirs, or by fear that any detail of survival on enemy-controlled ground could be misread. Yet traces accumulated. Some women gave statements to investigators and commissions, describing arrests, marches, camp routines, beatings, and the constant pressure of labour. These documents remained in archives, rarely published in full. Local newspapers printed short notes about liberated prisoners or captured camp staff, but seldom detailed individual histories. Memorial plaques went up for mass graves and battlefields, not for barracks and work detachments where women had spent years. The geography of suffering was divided. Visible sites of combat and anonymous sites of imprisonment. In families, memory worked differently. Fragments passed at kitchen tables, the name of a camp, the winter of marches, the barn where a column halted, a nurse who hid someone for a night. Some daughters and granddaughters grew up with a sense that there was something in the war that was not put in schoolbooks. Others learned nothing. Their mothers chose silence. When memoirs by former prisoners began to appear more openly, they often folded women's experiences into broader narratives, a few pages in volumes otherwise devoted to men's roots and front lines. Later, as archives opened and interviews were recorded systematically, more precise accounts emerged. Women described not only battles and decorations but also the mechanisms of captivity, how registration worked, how labour was organised, when violence escalated, who helped, who looked away. These testimonies filled some of the blank spaces between legal documents and official histories. Monuments and museum exhibits in former camps added names, photos, and reconstructed barracks, making it harder to speak of the war without acknowledging what happened behind wire. Even so, the map remains incomplete. Many records were destroyed. Many witnesses did not speak. Many crimes, especially those involving sexual violence, stayed outside legal and public language. What survives is a layered memory. State narratives of victory, local remembrance of losses, and individual stories in which Soviet women appear as fighters, prisoners, workers, and survivors. Together they show that the history of the Eastern War cannot be drawn only along front lines. It runs through roads to camps, through women's blocks and work details, through choices made in yards and corridors where no monument stands, but where, for those who passed, the war never ended when the guns fell silent.